All right, time to unpack this stack of research on subjectivity. It's one of those words, we use it all the time, but then you stop and think, what does it even mean?
Right.
So that's the mission for this deep dive, really getting into different scholarly takes on subjectivity. We've got excerpts from 2 research papers to dig into.
Okay.
And get this one uses this method called Q methodology to actually measure different viewpoints on subjectivity. Pretty cool, right?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating approach. It gets at how, we each experience and understand the world in our own unique ways,
Hmm.
which is kind of what subjectivity is all about when you get down to it.
Totally. It's like that old story about the blind man and the elephant, right?
Hmm.
Each one touches a different part. The tusk, the trunk, the leg,
Right.
and they all come to completely different conclusions about what an elephant is.
And that's a perfect analogy for how we approach subjectivity.
Hmm.
Like those blind men, our experiences, they shape our understanding. And
Yeah.
those understandings, they could be totally different, even when we're looking at the same thing.
Exactly. It's so true. And that's what's so interesting about one of these research papers. It uses that exact analogy as a jumping off point.
Yeah, it's by Lindbergh and some other researchers, and they really get into the nitty-gritty of subjectivity, how different scholars define it, how they understand it. And what's interesting is that even within academia, there isn't one single agreed-upon definition.
Which makes it even more important to unpack, right?
Definitely.
But before we get too deep in the weeds here, let's talk about this whole idea of how people traditionally view subjectivity, like how it's often pitted against objective truth,
Right. Yeah.
and maybe even gets a bad rap because of it.
Yeah, absolutely. For a long time, subjective has been seen as this less reliable form of knowledge. Something's based on personal feelings or
Yeah.
experiences.
Right.
It's dismissed, seen as biased, unreliable, not as valuable as cold, hard facts.
Which on the surface kind of makes sense, right? We want facts, proof. But can we ever be truly objective? Don't we all come to the table with our own baggage, our own experiences, biases, whether we're aware of them or not?
Exactly. And that's where the work of William Stevenson comes in. He was really a pioneer in studying subjectivity, and he saw it less about being right or wrong and more about understanding the individual's unique viewpoint.
So instead of just dismissing someone's perspective as just their opinion, we should be trying to understand where they're coming from, what experiences have shaped their view,
Right.
because their reality is their reality, even if it's different from ours.
Precisely.
Hmm?
It's about recognizing that different viewpoints exist, and those viewpoints are valid, even if they differ from our own. Moving away from this subjective versus objective thing and embracing the fact that we all have different perspectives, and that's okay.
Which is where this whole Q methodology thing comes in, right? It's like, how do we actually map these different perspectives? Do they hook people up to electrodes or something, analyze their brainwaves?
Not quite that invasive. Q methodology is a lot more elegant than that. It's a way to understand how people think about a topic, even if they've never explicitly put those thoughts into words. Imagine you've got a deck of cards, and you're asked to arrange them in a way that makes sense to you. That's kind of the idea here.
Wait, so instead of just asking, do you agree or disagree with this statement, they're asking you to, arrange these statements along a spectrum.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. So it's less about whether something is objectively true or false, and more about, how strongly someone feels about one statement compared to others.
You got it. And what's so cool is its sorting process. It reveals these underlying patterns in how people think. It's like this window into their subjective world, showing connections and relationships they might not even be consciously aware of.
Okay, now that is mind-blowing. So it's not just what people are telling you, it's what their sorting behavior reveals about their deeper perspectives, right?
Exactly. And that's what makes this second research paper we're looking at so intriguing. They use Q methodology to ask scholars, people who study subjectivity for a living, what is subjectivity?
Okay, I have to know, did they all agree? Or did things get a little more, shall we say, subjective?
Let's just say the blind man and the elephant metaphor makes a comeback in a big way.
All right, you've officially piqued my curiosity. Tell me more.
The study found not one, not two, but 5 distinct perspectives on subjectivity.
5. Okay, I'm starting to see why you called this a slippery concept. 5 shades of subjectivity. It's like, what, a philosophical mixtape or something. So walk me through it. What did these different perspectives actually look like?
All right, so picture this. You've got this group of scholars, right? Experts in their fields.
Okay, yeah,
And they're all looking at subjectivity, each through their own lens.
makes sense.
One group, let's call them perspective 1, they basically double down on what we were talking about before, the idea that subjectivity is all about individual understanding. But here's the thing, they believe we can measure it.
Really, like actually put a number on.
Exactly. They point to those Q sorts, the statements people arrange.
Right, right.
They say those sorts can give us hard data about subjective experiences.
Huh. So they're saying our feelings, our perceptions, they're not just these fluffy, intangible things. We can actually quantify them.
That's what Perspective One argues.
Yeah.
And there's another key point they make. Even though those subjective truths might be different for you and me,
Yeah.
they're still valid. Your reality is your reality. And that's something we should acknowledge, respect, both in ourselves and others.
I love that. Because just because someone else sees things differently, it doesn't mean one of you is wrong.
Right.
You're both coming from your own experiences, and those experiences matter.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But not everyone was on board with this whole measuring subjectivity thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Perspective Two, for example.
Yeah.
They took a different approach. They see subjectivity as much more fluid, constantly changing,
Interesting.
deeply personal, and always evolving.
So if perspective one is like, we can pinpoint your subjectivity, perspective two is saying it's more like trying to catch, what, lightning in a bottle.
Exactly. It's less about fixed viewpoints, more like this ongoing dance between our inner world and everything going on around us,
Okay, I'm with you.
like a river constantly flowing, being shaped by the land it passes through.
Oh, I like that analogy.
That's kind of how they see subjective experience.
So we've got measurables versus always in motion. What other perspectives came up in this study?
Well, Perspective 3 brings in a whole other layer. They take a more sociological approach,
Okay.
really focusing on how power dynamics, the social structures we live in, actually shape our subjective experiences.
Interesting. So it's not just about what we experience personally, but also about the social, cultural, even political context.
Exactly. Perspective 3 highlights how some voices, some perspectives, tend to get more attention,
Right.
while others are marginalized, even silenced. And those power dynamics, they directly impact how we understand the world around us.
It's like subjectivity becomes this lens for understanding not just individual differences, but like broader social inequalities too.
Precisely. And it makes you think about whose perspectives are considered valid, whose get listened to, and whose get ignored.
Really makes you think. Okay, so we've got three perspectives down. Subjectivity as measurable. Subjectivity as this fluid, ever-changing thing. And subjectivity as being intertwined with power and social forces. What about the other two? What did they bring to the table?
Perspective 4, they were all about self-awareness.
Interesting.
They argued that subjectivity boils down to our ability to reflect on our own experiences, our thoughts, to recognize our own biases and understand how they color our interpretations.
So it's not just about having opinions, it's about understanding why we hold those opinions, where they came from,
Right?
and maybe even recognizing that our own perspectives have limitations.
Exactly. They saw self-awareness as absolutely crucial for navigating a world full of different, sometimes conflicting viewpoints.
Which, let's face it, is the world we live in. Okay, so that's 4 down. Last but not least, perspective 5. What was their take?
Perspective 5 brought up this really interesting idea of shared subjectivity.
Shared subjectivity, what does that mean?
Well, they basically suggested that subjectivity isn't just an individual thing, it emerges from our interactions with others.
So it's like our subjective experiences are shaped not just by what happens to us personally, but also by our relationships, our communities, the
Right.
culture we're part of.
You got it. They emphasized how language, shared experiences, cultural norms, all these things contribute to this sense of shared understanding, even when we have our individual differences.
It's like we each have our own unique thread, but those threads are woven together into this larger tapestry of human experience.
I like that.
And even though the individual threads might be different colors, textures, whatever, they're all part of the same fabric.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it gets at why communication, dialogue, really trying to understand each other is so important.
Absolutely. So we've got 5 distinct perspectives here, each one kind of illuminating a different facet of this really complex thing we call subjectivity.
Yeah.
It's a lot to take in, but it really highlights how we each experience the world in our own way and how important it is to try and understand those different viewpoints.
100%. And that understanding, that willingness to see things through someone else's eyes, even if we don't agree with them, that's where empathy comes from, right? That's where real connection begins.
Totally agree. So where do we go from here? We've unpacked all these perspectives on subjectivity, but what's the takeaway for our listeners? What does it all mean for us in our everyday lives? I don't know about you, but I'm kind of feeling like all this research is like giving us a new set of lenses. to see past our own limited viewpoint and
Mm.
appreciate how other people see the world. But how do we actually use these lenses? It's not like we can whip out Q methodology every time we have a disagreement with someone.
Huh. Right. But it's not really about that, is it? What's really valuable here is understanding that different viewpoints aren't something to be afraid of. It's just part of being human. And if we can approach those differences, not with judgment, but with curiosity, well, that opens up a lot of possibility.
I love that. It's like shifting from, I need to convince you I'm right, to help me understand where you're coming from. But that's got to be one of the hardest things to actually do? Especially these days, it feels like it's just opinions being shouted from every direction. And then social media is always trying to stick us in these echo chambers where everyone thinks the same way.
Yeah, it's true. It can feel pretty overwhelming sometimes, all the information, all the opinions flying around. But that's exactly why this research is so relevant. It's not about pretending everyone sees things the same way. It's about figuring out how to navigate those differences.
So instead of getting stuck in those I'm right, you're wrong loops, we can use this knowledge about subjectivity to actually have better conversations, right?
Yeah.
But how do you actually do that? How do we bridge those divides, find common ground when it feels like everything's pulling us in different directions?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no simple answer. But for me, a big takeaway from all this research is that it starts with awareness.
Awareness.
Yeah. Awareness of our own subjectivity, our blind spots, our biases, and awareness that other people are coming from their own place, their own experiences.
Like we're all walking around with these invisible lenses on, shaping how we see everything. And sometimes we forget other people's lenses are going to look different than our own.
Exactly. And once we remember that, when we can see those different perspectives, not as threats, but as opportunities, that's where things can really open up.
I love that. Well, as we wrap up our deep dive into subjectivity, what a journey, right? I think the big question we're left with is this. If we all see the world through our own unique lens, how can we use that knowledge to bring people together? How can we see those different viewpoints as strengths? I don't know about you, but that's something I'll definitely be thinking about.
Me too.
And on that note, we'll leave you all to ponder those questions as well. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.